Shortly before 1 in the afternoon on March 7th, 1945, a task force from Combat Command B of the United States 9th Armored Division broke out of the woods onto the western heights above a quiet German town called Remagen and stopped cold. Below them, through the cold grey haze of an overcast afternoon, the Rhine River stretched wide and dark between steep valley walls. They expected to see what every American unit had seen for the past 2 weeks at every Rhine crossing: a destroyed bridge, broken stone towers, twisted steel hanging into the current. What they saw instead changed the war. The Ludendorff Bridge was standing, intact. A massive double-arch railroad bridge nearly 400 meters long, its stone towers rising from both banks, its deck still crowded with German soldiers, horse-drawn wagons, civilians, and even livestock pushing east in a desperate flood of retreat. Black smoke rose from the far bank, artillery rumbled off the valley walls, and yet the bridge stood. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman, commanding the task force, radioed back. Brigadier General William Hoge was brought forward. Hoge was not an ordinary officer. He had commanded the Provisional Engineer Special Brigade Group on Omaha Beach on D-Day, putting 30,000 men ashore in the most heavily defended stretch of the Normandy coast. He had fought through the Battle of the Bulge. He understood, the moment he raised his binoculars, exactly what he was looking at. A bridge over the Rhine, the last great barrier between Allied armies and the German heartland, still standing, still crossable, and within reach. He gave the order without hesitation. Take it. The commander of the 9th Armored Division, Major General John Leonard, had received a remark from 3rd Corps Commander Lieutenant General John Milliken the day before, according to accounts later reconstructed by Army historian Ken Heckler from participant interviews. If his division could reach the black line on the map, the Rhine itself, Milliken had said, his name would go down in history. Leonard had taken the comment in stride. Nobody actually expected any bridge to still be there. That same evening, as the news moved up the chain of command, General Omar Bradley received word by telephone from his first Army commander, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. Bradley called Eisenhower at headquarters in Reims. Eisenhower was at dinner with senior commanders when the call came through. He ordered as many troops across as possible and sent a formal message to First Army the next day. The whole Allied force, it read, was delighted to cheer the First Army, whose speed and boldness had won the race to establish the first bridgehead over the Rhine. But before any generals celebrated anything, a task force on a ridge above Remagen had seen what they were not supposed to see, and a 22-year-old lieutenant from Nebraska was already walking his men down toward the water. To understand why that bridge mattered so deeply, and why the German command collapsed inward on itself in the days that followed, you have to understand what the Rhine meant to Germany, not simply as geography, as identity. For 2,000 years, the Rhine had been the defining edge of the Western world. Roman legions under Drusus and Tiberius garrisoned its western bank and built watchtowers against the Germanic tribes to the east. Medieval emperors built their palaces along its terraces. The great cathedrals of Cologne and Mainz rose from its floodplains. In the early 19th century, as Germany groped toward national unity through war and politics, the river was elevated from geography into myth. In 1813, the nationalist Ernst Moritz Arndt wrote that the Rhine was Germany's river, not Germany's border. In 1840, a poet named Max Schneckenburger wrote a poem called Die Wacht am Rhein, The Watch on the Rhine. Set to music by Karl Wilhelm in 1854, it became Imperial Germany's de facto second anthem, sung through the Franco-Prussian War and the First World War alike. Its message was simple: stand guard at this water. Let nothing cross from the west. Heinrich Heine's Lorelei haunted its cliffs. Wagner's Rhine maidens swam its currents. The Nibelung cycle placed its greatest heroes on its banks. By 1945, Hitler had enshrined the river in operational doctrine as the Reich's final natural wall. His armies were instructed to hold it. His engineers had mined every bridge. His commanders understood that so long as no enemy soldier stood east of that water, Germany, in some ancient and psychological sense, remained undefeated. For the men defending it, the Rhine was not a defensive line. It was the last promise. The bridge they were defending had its own history, as violent as the century that built it. The original concept came from German General Staff planning in 1912, when officers developing war plans for a rapid invasion of France identified the need for additional Rhine crossings to speed troop movements westward. 3 new railroad bridges were authorized, including one at Remagen. Construction was deferred as peacetime budgets resisted the cost. When the First World War broke out and the Western Front collapsed into stalemate, the military urgency became undeniable. Construction of the Remagen Bridge began in 1916 under the direct patronage of First Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, the man who effectively ran Germany's war economy and military planning from 1916 until the armistice. The bridge carried his name. The design came from the engineer Karl Wiener. The masonry piers and stone abutment towers were raised by the firm Grun and Bilfinger. The steel superstructure was fabricated at the Man Works at Gustavsburg. Much of the construction labor was performed by Russian prisoners of war, men captured on the Eastern Front and set to work far from home. The cost was approximately 2.1 million marks. The main bridge was structurally complete by 1918. The railroad tunnel bored through the base of the Erpeler cliff on the east bank was finished in 1919, after the guns had gone quiet. The physical result was formidable. The total span from bank to bank was 398 meters. The main steel section stretched 325 meters over the river. The central arch rose 28.5 meters above the water at its highest point. The entire steel superstructure weighed 4,640 tons. The deck carried 2 railroad tracks, one of which had been planked over for vehicle traffic by 1945. The bridge was military architecture from its foundations. Both abutments were flanked by fortified stone towers with rifle loopholes cut through the walls, and internal spaces large enough to shelter substantial numbers of troops. The piers contained pre-built demolition chambers connected by steel-lined conduits to firing positions on the bank. When French forces occupied the Rhineland after the First World War, they filled those chambers with concrete. In 1938, German engineers restored them and restocked each pier with military explosive charges. 60 zinc-lined boxes were distributed at key structural points across the bridge. By March 7, 1945, those 60 boxes of military explosive were gone. What remained at the bridge when the Americans arrived was something far weaker, and it would make all the difference. By the time Engermann's task force reached the ridge above Remagen, the war in the West had been collapsing for months. The Wehrmacht's last large offensive in the West, the Ardennes operation launched in December 1944, had failed at enormous cost in men, tanks, and irreplaceable aviation fuel. By late January 1945, the Allied initiative was permanent. In the east, the catastrophe was even more complete. The Soviet Vistula Oder offensive, opened on January 12, 1945, had carried Red Army columns from the Vistula to the Oder River in less than 3 weeks. Berlin was now less than 60 miles from the nearest Soviet bridgehead. Königsberg was encircled. Budapest had fallen. Hitler had retreated to the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing orders to armies that existed mainly on paper, moving units on maps that no longer corresponded to any reality on the ground. In the West, 3 Allied operations in February and early March had destroyed what remained of German forces west of the Rhine. Operation Veritable drove the 1st Canadian Army through the Reichswald forest. Operation Grenade sent the American 9th Army across the Roer River. Operation Lumberjack, launched March 1st, swept American 1st and 3rd Armies through the central Rhineland between Cologne and Koblenz, encircling and destroying German formations faster than German headquarters could account for the losses. In those weeks alone, approximately 280,000 German troops were captured and another 120,000 killed or wounded. Cologne fell on March 5th. German engineers blew the Hohenzollern Bridge there just hours before American tanks reached its western ramp. At every Rhine crossing from Switzerland to the North Sea, the pattern repeated. The Germans demolished their bridges. The Allies arrived to find broken stone and cold water. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had built his strategy on that assumption. At the Malta Conference in late January and early February 1945, the Allied High Command had agreed on a broad front advance with 2 principal Rhine crossings. Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group was preparing a massive set-piece assault crossing near Wessel, supported by over 1 million troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and the largest single-day airborne operation in history, the combined operations Plunder and Varsity, scheduled for the night of March 23. Further south, Patton's Third Army would make its own crossing in the Mainz and Oppenheim area. The central Rhine sector at Remagen, dominated on the east bank by the sheer Erpeler cliff and offering limited roads into the difficult Westerwald highlands, was specifically ruled out as unsuitable for a main crossing. The terrain east of Remagen genuinely was poor for mechanized operations. The cliff road up from the river was narrow. The Westerwald hills beyond it were dense and forested. Nobody had planned for the bridge to still be there. On the German side, the situation in those first days of March was not merely deteriorating, it was dissolving. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B was attempting to extract the survivors of General Gustav Adolf von Zangen's 15th Army back across the Rhine before American columns could cut them off. Roads were jammed with retreating columns, artillery pieces, horse-drawn supply wagons, and streams of civilians who had joined the military retreat eastward. Allied fighter bombers owned the daylight hours, making movement in the open suicidal. Radio communications were fragmenting as units lost their equipment and their operators. Command authority was shifting every few hours as generals were sacked, reassigned, or simply unreachable. The broader German strategic situation offered no reserve of hope to draw from. There were no fresh divisions to commit. The training pipeline had collapsed. The fuel shortage that kept Luftwaffe jets on the ground for days at a time affected ground forces equally. German soldiers in March 1945 were fighting on reduced rations, with inadequate ammunition, in units that had been stripped of their heavy weapons to fill gaps elsewhere on the front. The will to resist was not uniform. Some formations fought with genuine tenacity, others dissolved on contact. One German officer had actually identified Remagen as the danger point weeks before. Von Zangen, a steady infantry commander who had studied his maps carefully, recognized that the natural topography of the Ahr and Rheinbach valleys would funnel Allied armoured forces directly toward Remagen and the Ludendorff Bridge. He asked Model to position reserves there and establish a proper defence. Model, sharing the Allied planners' own dismissal of the central Rhine as unsuitable terrain, refused and sent his few available mobile reserves north toward Bonn instead. Von Zangen's assessment was the most accurate piece of German operational analysis in the entire Western campaign. It was ignored. He survived the war. The defence of the bridge itself had collapsed into overlapping jurisdictions that no single officer controlled. Captain Willy Brache, a combat veteran wearing 2 Iron Crosses, held the title of Combat Commander for the bridge area, but only in emergency. On the morning of March 7, he commanded exactly 36 men, most of them convalescents and Volkssturm militia with no meaningful combat capability. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, an engineer officer, was the technical bridge commander, personally responsible for demolition. A Luftwaffe officer had commanded the anti-aircraft guns on top of the Erpeler Lay, but his unit had been abruptly ordered to Koblenz the previous day, leaving the high ground essentially undefended with no replacement in place. To fill the command vacuum, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps dispatched his adjutant, Major Johannes Scheller, with 8 men and a radio, ordering him to take charge at the bridge. Scheller set out at approximately 1:20 in the morning of March 7th, for what should have been a routine drive of about 60 kilometers. He ran low on fuel. He had to reroute around advancing American columns. His radio team became separated from him. He reached Remagen at 11:15 in the morning, less than 2 hours before Engermann's task force appeared on the heights above the town. The demolition arrangements were no better than the command structure. Captain Brache had requested 600 kilograms of military explosives to destroy the bridge. What arrived at 11 in the morning on March 7 was 300 kilograms, and not military explosive at all. The engineers delivered Donnerit, a weak ammonium nitrate industrial mining explosive used in quarries, far less powerful than the military charges the demolition chambers had been designed for. Brache had no choice. He placed all of it on the southeastern pier and hoped. A further layer of paralysis had been introduced by Hitler's own standing orders. After German officers had been court-martialed for blowing bridges prematurely earlier in the war, commanders across the Rhine in March 1945 had become terrified of firing their charges too early. The formal standing order required written authorization before detonation. Every hour of hesitation was another hour of American advance. When Major Scheller arrived and saw the scale of the retreating columns still crossing the bridge, he faced competing pressures simultaneously. Artillery officers asked him to wait for their guns to cross. A Luftwaffe First Lieutenant, Karl-Heinz Peters, pleaded for time to get his battery of secret Henschel multiple rocket launchers, a new weapon the Germans were determined to keep from Allied intelligence. Across, before the bridge was destroyed, Scheller agreed to wait. Every minute he granted was a minute Engerman's column was moving down the hill. On the western heights, Brigadier General Hogue had already given the order to attack. Lieutenant Colonel Engerman assembled his assault group. Leading would be the newest American tank in the theatre, the Pershing, armed with a 90mm gun capable of defeating a German Panther at combat ranges. 4 operational Pershings of Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon from Company A of the 14th Tank Battalion would roll ahead. Following on foot would be A Company of the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Karl Timmerman. Engerman's order was plain: get through the town as fast as possible and reach the bridge. Karl Timmerman was 22 years old. He had been born in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, in the Niederrad district, on June 19, 1922. His father was an American soldier from West Point, Nebraska, who had served in the occupation army after the First World War and married a local German woman named Maria Weisbecker. The family immigrated to Nebraska in January 1924, when Karl was 18 months old. He grew up in West Point, a small agricultural town on the Elkhorn River, speaking English with his father and German with his grandparents during their visits. He attended Citizens Military Training Camp as a young man, was commissioned through Officers' Candidate School, and fought at St. Vith in the Battle of the Bulge during the desperate weeks of December 1944. During that fighting at St. Vith, his unit was overrun, and several men from his company's support staff were captured or killed in the chaos of the German breakthrough. The 9th Armoured Division had held the critical road junction at St. Vith for several days against repeated German attacks before being forced to withdraw, buying time that Allied planners later credited with blunting the Ardennes offensive's northern thrust. Timmerman himself survived that fighting. He was wounded by shell fragments and decorated with the Purple Heart. He had taken command of a company on March 6, 1945, one day before Remagen. He did not yet know that his wife Lavera had given birth to their daughter Gay Diane on February 28, a week earlier. The letter announcing his daughter's arrival had not reached the front. At approximately 1:50 in the afternoon, Timmerman's company dismounted and started down the hill into Remagen on foot. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, Captain Friesenhahn detonated a cratering charge on the western approach ramp of the bridge. The explosion punched a roughly 10-meter hole in the earthen embankment in front of the ramp, designed to stop tanks from rolling directly onto the span. The blast knocked Friesenhahn himself unconscious. He came to 15 minutes later to find American tanks already in the outskirts of the town below him. Grimball's Pershings moved through Remagen's streets, trading fire with scattered German positions. One Pershing engaged a German train on the tracks about 800 yards down the eastern bank, firing its 90mm gun and bringing it to a halt in a burst of steam. Captain Bratch's 36 defenders scattered. Some crossed the bridge before the Americans reached the western ramp. Others simply disappeared into the rubble. By 3 in the afternoon, Remagen itself had fallen. Timmerman's infantry reached the western end of the bridge and looked across nearly 400 meters of open steel over the dark, swift Rhine. On the far bank, German soldiers could be seen running for the tunnel entrance at the base of the Erpeler Lay cliff. Smoke drifted across the deck from the earlier cratering explosion. The bridge was damaged but standing. At approximately 3:15, Major Scheller, watching through binoculars from inside the Eastern Railroad tunnel, gave the order to fire the main demolition charges and destroy the bridge. Engineer Captain Friesenhahn turned the electrical firing key. Nothing happened. An American shell had likely severed one of the steel-protected conduits, carrying the firing circuit somewhere along the span. The main circuit was dead. Friesenhahn assessed the situation and called for a volunteer. Corporal Anton Faust sprinted out onto the bridge deck under American machine gun and rifle fire, located the manual backup primer cord, lit it, and ran back for the tunnel entrance. He survived. At approximately 3:20, a muffled concussion shook the bridge. The massive steel structure visibly lifted off its piers in a column of smoke and debris, hung for a moment, and settled back down onto the water, twisted and groaning but intact. The Donnerit charge on the southeastern pier had detonated. The other charges, dependent on the severed electrical circuit, had not. The steelwork absorbed the blast. The bridge stood. On the western ramp, Timmerman watched the smoke clear. He had seen the German attempt to destroy the bridge fail before his eyes. He turned to his platoon leaders and gave the order. Get going. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a 34-year-old butcher from Holland, Ohio, led his squad down the center of the bridge at a run. German machine gunners in the eastern stone towers opened fire. Riflemen on the heights of the Erpelallee fired down from above. A German marksman on a moored barge in the river fired up at the bridge deck. Drabik ran in a straight line down the center of the span, never weaving, never stopping. He recalled it simply afterward. He did not think about the bridge blowing. He did not think about the history of the moment. He was focused entirely on reaching the far end without being shot. His squad followed in column, moving fast through the smoke and the noise of the firefight on both flanks. The bridge deck was slick in places from the earlier demolition attempt. The steel arch creaked beneath them. Rifle and machine gun fire pocked the deck around their feet. None of them stopped. At approximately 3:50 in the afternoon of March 7th, 1945, Sergeant Drabik leapt from the end of the bridge onto the east bank of the Rhine. He was the first American soldier to cross the Rhine River under arms. Timmerman followed as the 10th man across, becoming the first American officer on the east bank. While the riflemen ran, 3 combat engineers moved onto the bridge structure itself. First Lieutenant Hugh Mott, along with Staff Sergeant John Reynolds and Sergeant Eugene Dorland, of the 2nd Platoon of Company B, 9th Armoured Engineer Battalion, worked along the girders with wire cutters and pliers, cutting demolition leads and throwing unexploded charges into the river below them, while German fire cracked overhead. The work was close and deliberate and dangerous. A German machine gun position in the far tower had a direct angle onto the underside of the bridge. Mott's team worked in bursts, moving between the girders, cutting each lead they could find, systematically dismantling the demolition network, while the infantry fight for the far towers continued above them on the deck. By 4 in the afternoon, all of A Company was on the east bank. The eastern stone towers were cleared and secured. Not a single American soldier had been killed on the span itself. Captain Bracci and Captain Friesenhahn, trapped in the eastern railroad tunnel with hundreds of German soldiers, foreign laborers, civilians and animals, surrendered before dark. Brigadier General Hoge sent his report up the chain of command in 5 words. Well, we got the bridge. By midnight, approximately 120 American infantrymen were dug into the east bank. Had German commanders organized a determined counterattack at first light on March 8th, the thin American perimeter might have been pushed back into the river. They could not react in time. The bridgehead was a fact. When word reached Field Marshal Model's headquarters, and from there to Hitler's bunker in Berlin, the response was not measured. It was a collapse of a different kind. Hitler received the news on the evening of March 7th. Those present described his reaction as one of the most violent episodes of the war. He called the loss of the bridge a military catastrophe of the first order. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was dismissed as Commander-in-Chief West on March 10th and replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who arrived to find conditions on the Western Front already beyond recovery, and immediately described the situation as nearly catastrophic. Hitler's response went further than personnel changes. On March 10th, he established an institution with no precedent in German military history, the Fliehendes Sonderstandsgericht West, the Flying Special Court Martial West. He appointed Generalleutnant Rudolf Hübner, who had no legal training, as its presiding judge and sole prosecutor. The court travelled with its own attached firing squad. It was authorized to try officers and execute them on the spot. The trials were not proceedings in any recognizable legal sense. Each defendant faced a harangue lasting minutes before a verdict was announced. Major Hans Scheller, the 31-year-old corps adjutant who had arrived too late, attempted to restore order with no men and no weapons, and left on a bicycle when his radio failed so he could report to his superiors in person, was sentenced to death. He and First Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, the Luftwaffe battery commander who had asked for more time at the bridge, were executed by firing squad on approximately March 13 or 14, 1945, in a forest near Rimbach in the Westerwald. Scheller left behind his wife Liesel and 3 children. The injustice embedded in those verdicts was visible even at the time. Scheller had set out before 2 in the morning, driven 60 kilometers through roads clogged with retreating German forces, arrived with 8 men and a broken radio, and faced a situation that no officer with his resources could have influenced. He was shot for it, while the generals who had created the defensive vacuum at Remagen, who had dismissed von Zangen's warnings and sent inadequate explosive to the bridge, remained in their posts or faced nothing worse than reassignment. Major Herbert Strobel, the engineer regiment staff commander responsible for demolition support during the 15th Army's retreat, and Major August Kraft, the engineer battalion commander with troops at the bridge, were court-martialed and also executed in the Westerwald, at a site near Oberirsen, within days of Scheller and Peters. Captain Willy Bratje was sentenced to death in absentia. He was already in American custody and could not be executed. He survived the war. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, who had actually attempted to detonate the charges and whose failure was the result of a severed firing circuit rather than any negligence, was acquitted. He too was in American hands and lived. General Major Richard von Bothmer, the commandant of the Bonn area, was demoted to private and sentenced to imprisonment following a separate proceeding on March 10th. He took his own life shortly after sentencing. The pension rights of the executed officers were stripped at the time. They were restored after the war. Rudolf Hübner, the court's presiding judge, was himself tried and sentenced after the war. What the executions revealed was the character of a regime in its final weeks. The German commanders who had failed at Remagen had not been incompetent in any meaningful sense. They had been given 36 men, 300 kilograms of the wrong explosive, conflicting orders from 4 different chains of command, a radio that did not work, and less than 2 hours to respond to an armoured attack that nobody above them had predicted. They were shot for it, while the men who had actually failed to prepare the defence at every level above them died in retirement or in forests of their own choosing. Kesselring, arriving to replace Rundstedt on March 10th, surveyed the situation west of the Rhine and said plainly that conditions were nearly catastrophic. He had no more honest description to offer. The bridgehead that had cost 4 German officers their lives was growing by the hour, and every hour the Americans remained east of the river was an hour German planners had counted on having to prepare something that now would never be prepared. The entire German defensive plan in the west rested on the Rhine. The working assumption was that Allied armies would be delayed at the river long enough for the Wehrmacht to consolidate a coherent defense on the eastern bank. Every bridge had been prepared for demolition. Every crossing was monitored. 2 to 3 weeks of preparation time, bought by the river itself, might allow something resembling a stable front to form. Remagen destroyed that calculation in a single afternoon. With American infantry digging in east of the Erpeler Lay, German reserve formations that had been positioned to resist the expected British and American assault crossings in the north now had to be redirected south to contain the unexpected bridgehead. The 11th Panzer Division and surviving elements of the Panzer Lehr Division were pulled away from positions opposite Montgomery's planned crossing area near Wesel and thrown into attritional fighting in the wooded Westerwald Hills, east of Remagen. Those formations were consumed over 10 days of grinding combat in terrain that favoured the defender, but absorbed the attacker's time and energy. When Montgomery launched Operation Plunder on the night of March 23, followed the next morning by Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, with the British 6th and American 17th Airborne Divisions dropping east of the Rhine, the German formations that should have been waiting in prepared positions had already been partly bled dry 70 kilometres to the south. Patton, unwilling to let Montgomery have the stage alone, had his Third Army across the Rhine at Nierstein on the night of March 22, the day before Plunder, in an improvised crossing that he telephoned to Bradley the following morning with characteristic delight. The crossing at Remagen had unlocked the psychology of the Rhine for the entire Allied command. For the men inside the bridgehead, the 10 days after the initial crossing were not a triumph. They were a siege. Within 24 hours of the capture, engineers had begun repairing the Ludendorff while simultaneously constructing parallel bridges. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, with 2 treadway bridge companies, they began work at 8:30 in the morning on March 9th and completed a steel treadway bridge across the Rhine by 5:10 in the afternoon on March 10th. A pontoon bridge and a Bailey bridge followed in subsequent days. The forward construction position on the treadway, fully exposed to German artillery observation from the hills to the east, became known among the engineers working there as Suicide Point, after a direct artillery hit on March 9th killed 1 man and wounded 5 others. The engineers who worked on the Ludendorff itself did so knowing the bridge might come down at any moment. The structure had been distorted by the failed demolition. It had absorbed 24 direct artillery hits in the first 2 days alone. Each repair team that went out onto the span worked under fire, cutting away damaged sections, bolting in replacement steelwork, testing load limits, while German guns on the heights to the east tracked their movements. The men who died when the bridge finally collapsed on March 17th were repairing rivets and structural members when the sound of metal fatigue gave them an instant's warning before the arch gave way. They went out on the bridge because the job was not finished yet. Every weapon the German military could assemble was turned against the bridgehead. Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe launched 367 separate sorties over 10 days, a concentration of effort extraordinary for an air force that by March 1945 was critically short of fuel and trained pilots. Among those missions, Arado R-234B2 jet bombers of the Gefechtsverband Kowalewski made multiple attack runs against the bridge, escorted by Messerschmitt. Me-26, 2 jet fighter bombers of Kampfgeschwader 51, commanded by Major Hans-Georg Becher. It was the first time in the history of warfare that jet bombers were used in a tactical ground attack role. They dropped their ordnance through a wall of anti-aircraft fire and hit nothing of consequence. The American anti-aircraft response assembled around the bridgehead was described by a subsequent United States Army Armor School study as the greatest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery in American military history. Approximately 670 anti-aircraft guns at peak deployment, including those of the 482nd Anti-Aircraft Artillery Automatic Weapons Battalion, along with 25 barrage balloons, ringed the crossing sites. The volume of fire was so intense that falling spent .50 caliber rounds from American guns caused roughly 200 bruise and impact casualties among American troops on the ground below. On Hitler's personal order, 11 ballistic missiles were fired from the SS Werfer Abteilung 500 at sites near Hellendoorn in the occupied Netherlands against the Remagen Bridge on March 17, 1945. It was the only tactical use of these weapons during the entire war. It was the only time in history that they were launched at a target inside Germany itself. All 11 missed the bridge. The nearest impact struck a command post of the 284th Engineer Combat Battalion, approximately 270 meters from the bridge, killing 3 American soldiers. German artillery was the most damaging weapon throughout. More than 100 guns had been positioned in the hills east of the bridgehead, including dozens of 105 and 150 mm howitzers and heavier pieces. Over the first 2 days alone, the bridge took 24 direct artillery hits. On March 9th, a German shell struck an ammunition truck parked on the deck, blowing a roughly 5-meter hole through the planking and putting the bridge temporarily out of service. On the night of March 17, a small team of specially trained German naval demolition swimmers, equipped with Italian closed-circuit rebreathers, entered the Rhine upstream with orders to plant charges on the bridge structures. Learning en route that the Ludendorff had already collapsed, they were redirected to the American pontoon bridge between Kripp and Linz. They entered the river 17 kilometers upstream because of how far the American perimeter had advanced, and attempted to float downstream through water of approximately 7 degrees Celsius. They were caught in the beams of 13 million candle power, Canal Defense Light searchlights mounted on specially modified M3 Lee tanks of the 738th Tank Battalion, a weapons system so secret that its existence would not be publicly acknowledged for years. It was the first time those searchlight tanks were used in combat. 2 swimmers died of hypothermia. 2 were killed. 3 were captured. The bridge itself, already distorted by the failed demolition of March 7th, had absorbed more than 10 days of artillery impacts, near misses, the vibration of heavy military traffic, and the stress of continuous repair work. On March 17th, 1945, at approximately 3 in the afternoon, it gave out. The great steel arch buckled without warning, the sound of popping rivets heard by engineers on the deck, an instant before the structure folded into the Rhine. 28 United States Army engineers were killed. 63 were wounded. By that afternoon, it did not matter strategically. Two treadway bridges and a pontoon bridge were already carrying the traffic. The bridgehead had long since outgrown the structure that created it. On March 25, 1945, 18 days after Drabick crossed, United States First Army broke out of the Remagen bridgehead and drove east and north into the German interior. Armoured columns from First Army and Ninth Army, which had crossed near Wessel following Operation Plunder, drove toward each other and linked up near the town of Lippstadt on April 1st. The Ruhr pocket was sealed. Field Marshal Walter Model's entire Army Group B, the largest coherent German formation remaining in the West, was encircled. The pocket collapsed over the following 3 weeks. Over 325,000 German troops surrendered by approximately April 18th. Model, who had refused von Zangen's warnings about Remagen, who had watched his army destroyed inside a trap that might never have formed without the bridge, walked into a forest near Duisburg on April 21st and shot himself. He was 54 years old. Soviet and American forces linked up at Torgau on the Elbe on April 25th. Hitler died in the bunker on April 30th. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge was never rebuilt. The 2 river piers, a hazard to Rhine navigation, were removed in the summer of 1976. Mayor Hans-Peter Curtin of Remagen, the driving force behind the bridge's post-war commemoration, sold pieces of the demolished stone piers as souvenirs and paperweights, using the proceeds toward what came next. In 1980, the 2 surviving stone towers on the western bank were converted into the Friedensmuseum Brücke von Remagen, the Peace Museum Bridge at Remagen. Visitors climb through the fortified levels of the towers themselves, past the same stone rifle loopholes through which German soldiers once fired, past exhibits of helmets, uniforms, photographs, a recovered artillery shell, and a detailed model of the bridge. The museum also documents the Rheinwiesenlager, the open-field prisoner-of-war camps in the area where large numbers of captured German soldiers were held through the spring of 1945. The museum's founding motto is that every day we should work for peace with our mind and heart, each person beginning with himself. A peace bell stands on the riverbank, rung in memory of the war's victims without regard to nationality. On March 7, 1985, the 40th anniversary of the crossing, German veterans placed a bronze plaque on the western tower. Today there is no Rhine crossing for 44 kilometers in either direction from Remagen. The river moves through the same valley, unchanged by what happened above it. In the United States, Carl Timmerman is commemorated by a memorial in West Point, Nebraska, dedicated May 30, 1965, and by the bridge over the Elkhorn River in that town that carries his name. A theater at Fort Dix, New Jersey is named in his honor. He received the Distinguished Service Cross on April 5, 1945, from Major General John Leonard. He served again during the Korean War. He died on October 21, 1951, of cancer. He was 29 years old. He never met the daughter born to him 1 week before the crossing. Sergeant Drabick returned to Holland, Ohio, worked again as a butcher, and received his own Distinguished Service Cross. In 1957, Ken Heckler published his account of the bridge's capture, drawing on interviews conducted with participants on both sides in the weeks and months after the war. Drabick gave those interviews freely. He answered every question the same way. He ran because he was told to run, and he kept running because stopping would have been worse. He died in an automobile accident on September 28, 1993, on Interstate 70 in Missouri, while traveling to a reunion of the 9th Armored Division. He was 82 years old. The strategic debate over Remagen has continued since the war ended. German generals argued in their memoirs that the Rhine would have been forced regardless, that the terrain east of the Erpelallee was too difficult for rapid exploitation, and that the decisive crossing was always going to be Montgomery's operation in the north. The terrain argument has some merit. The breakout from Remagen did take 18 days. But the full arithmetic tells a different story. German reserve formations that were needed opposite Montgomery's Wessel crossing were instead consumed at Remagen. The psychological barrier of the Rhine, on which German defensive planning had depended, was broken 2 weeks before the planned Allied main effort. The Ruhr encirclement, which destroyed the last coherent German field force in the west, depended on the armies that broke out from the Remagen bridgehead as its southern arm. And the hours that German headquarters spent summoning courts martial, issuing execution orders, and dismissing generals were hours not spent organizing any coherent response. Eisenhower later described the bridge as worth its weight in gold, one of those bright opportunities of war which, when quickly and firmly grasped, produce incalculable effects on future operations. Ken Heckler, the Army historian who had interviewed participants on both sides within weeks of the events and published his account in 1957, estimated that the capture shortened the war by weeks. The precise measure of what might have been cannot be calculated. What is beyond dispute is that on the afternoon of March 7, 1945, a small task force solved the largest remaining tactical problem on the Western Front by simply moving faster than anyone on either side expected, and that the men who ran across that bridge changed the final shape of the war in Europe. None of the men who ran across that bridge that afternoon understood in the moment what they had done or what would follow from it. Drabick said it plainly when asked about it afterward. "It was not a historical moment for me. I was too busy running. I just wanted to get to the other side." He got there, and the war followed him across. The Ludendorff Bridge had stood since 1918. It was built partly by prisoners of war on the orders of a man whose name it carried. It was designed as an instrument of military power, occupied and contested through 2 world wars, and ultimately destroyed not by enemy action but by accumulated damage, failed repairs, and the weight of what passed over it. It stood for 10 days after Drabick crossed it, and then it fell into the river. What the Battle of Remagen ultimately reveals is something about how decisive moments in war actually arrive. They are rarely the ones that were planned. They come without announcement, through the intersection of small decisions, individual courage, institutional failure, and the kind of coincidence that no staff officer could write into any plan. A bridge that should have been destroyed weeks earlier, explosives that were the wrong kind and placed in the wrong location, a firing circuit severed by a single shell at the exact wrong moment, a sergeant from Ohio who simply ran and did not stop. The Rhine was the river that had defined the western edge of civilization for 2,000 years. German nationalists had turned it into a hymn. Hitler had made it into a military doctrine and a strategic plan. On a grey March afternoon, it was crossed in the mud by men who were mostly thinking about not getting shot. It was just a river, after all. Drabick was already on the other side, and the men behind him kept coming. 8 weeks later, the Third Reich was gone.